Okay, so you're with us for another deep dive. And today we're going to try to unpack something I think pretty much everyone listening has dealt with at some point, grief and loss.
Yeah.
And we've got some really interesting sources to kind of pull apart and see what we can learn from them.
Hmm.
We've got a guide that's specifically about how children experience and understand grief.
Okay.
We've got a guide to the dying process, which we've talked about a bit before, but this is like a really in-depth look at some of the things that happen.
Yeah.
And then we've got a couple of transcripts from like actual audio and video sessions of people talking about their grief.
Interest.
So it's like a lot of different perspectives on a really big topic.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And I think pulling out the essentials is going to be so valuable for the listeners because, we all experience this at some point.
Totally. And I
Yeah.
think especially like how grief shows up differently
Oh, yeah.
depending on who you are.
Yeah. Your age, your relationship with the person who died.
Totally. And then I think the biggest thing we want to get out of this is like, how do we actually support people?
Right. Because everyone wants to help.
Yeah.
But sometimes you just don't know what to do.
Exactly. So hopefully by the end of this, we'll all have some better tools to be there for people.
Exactly. I like it.
Okay. So to start, I think it's helpful to get on the same page with some of the terms we're going to be using because they get thrown around a lot, but they have pretty distinct meanings.
Yeah, for sure.
Like loss, grief, bereavement.
Yeah. Let's define those.
Yeah. So loss, like how would you even explain that? Like what's the most basic way to think about loss?
Well, I think of it as like a separation
Okay.
from something or someone that matters a lot to you, something
Yeah.
you have a strong attachment to.
Okay. So it could be a person, but it could also be,
Oh, it could be so many things.
yeah.
It could be, and especially when we think about kids later on, it might be like a toy, a beloved toy, or, a friend moving away.
Oh, yeah.
But for adults, it can be much broader.
Yeah.
I mean, think about like a loss of health,
Yeah.
financial security,
Mm-hmm.
safety, even like in the world today,
Totally.
a huge relationship ending,
Yeah.
or even just like losing your vision for the future.
Yeah, like the future you thought you were going to have.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's loss. And then how is grief different from that?
So grief is the response
Okay.
to the loss.
Okay.
It's how we react to that separation.
Okay. And that's so individual, right?
It's so individual.
Yeah.
It's natural. It's human. Like every single one of us experiences grief in some way.
Yeah.
But how it shows up is totally unique.
Hmm.
But it's all rooted in that fundamental need for connection and love.
Yeah. And it's not just in our heads, right? Like it affects our bodies
Yeah,
too.
for sure. Grief is not just an emotion.
Yeah.
It's
yeah.
like this whole body experience. It affects us emotionally, physically, in our social interactions, even the way we think changes.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so we've got loss, the separation, grief, that super individual response, and then there's bereavement.
Right. So bereavement, that's the state of having experienced a significant loss.
Okay, so it's like the whole,
The whole thing.
yeah, the whole process.
The whole process. And for most people, it comes with a lot of distress.
Yeah.
I mean, it's intense. And interestingly, it can actually start before a death.
Really?
Yeah, like once a life-threatening illness is diagnosed,
Oh, wow.
that's when that journey can begin. And it continues way beyond the actual passing.
So it's not just like the day of or the week after?
No, it's a long process. And a
Oh,
crucial part of it is trying to make sense of your life without that person.
Yeah, like how does my world look now?
Exactly. How do I fit into this new reality?
Okay, so we've got those three, and then I think there's one more that's important to mention, mourning.
Mourning.
So how is that different?
So mourning, that's how we show our grief outwardly,
Oh, okay.
is the public face of it.
Yeah.
And it's so tied to our culture and our traditions.
Okay, so it's like the rituals.
The rituals, yeah, the things we do
Yeah.
that are considered appropriate ways to express our grief.
So that can be so different depending on where you are in the world.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so I think one of the most important things to remember about all of this is that grief, it's normal.
Yes.
It's a natural human process.
It's not something to rush
No.
or like get over.
Yeah, you don't just get over it.
You don't just get over it.
And I think society puts so much pressure on us to like
Oh, yeah.
move on.
To just move on.
Yeah. And not talk about death.
Right. It's like this taboo subject.
Yeah. And like grief is depressing. So just like keep it to yourself.
Exactly.
But one of the sources we looked at had this quote that I just love that totally reframes this whole idea.
Oh, tell me.
It's from Rachel Nomi Riemann. She says, grieving is a way of self-care.
I love that.
Isn't that amazing? Like, allowing yourself to grieve is actually taking care of yourself.
That's so powerful. And I think especially for anyone listening who's in a caring role,
Oh, totally.
whether you're a healthcare professional or just someone who supports others,
Yeah.
that idea that acknowledging and processing your own grief is self-care,
Yeah.
that's huge.
Totally. And grief, it can show up in so many different ways, right?
Oh, yeah. So many ways.
Like, even just socially, how can grief affect us?
But you might feel this like push and pull.
Okay.
Like 1 minute, you want to be around people all the time.
Yeah.
Maybe because you're scared of being alone.
Yeah.
Or you just need that reassurance.
Right.
And then the next minute, you just want to be completely alone.
Yeah.
Like withdraw completely. And that can even lead to social anxiety for some people.
Yeah. Like, I don't even want to go out anymore.
Exactly.
Okay. And then emotionally, I mean, that's the big one, right?
Emotionally, it's a roller coaster.
Yeah.
I mean, sadness is usually the first thing we think of, but anger is a big part of it too.
Oh, yeah.
And sometimes it's directed outwards.
Right at the doctors, at the situation.
Yes, whoever you feel like is to blame.
Yeah.
But then there's also numbness.
Yeah.
Like you shut down
Yeah.
as a way to protect yourself.
Yeah.
And that can sometimes be delayed.
Oh, yeah.
Like it doesn't hit you right away.
Right.
And then sometimes you feel all these conflicting emotions at the same time.
Yeah.
Like you can feel relief that the
Right.
suffering is over, but also profound sadness that they're gone.
Yeah.
It's so complex.
Totally. And then anxiety.
Yeah.
Like, the world doesn't feel safe anymore.
Exactly. Like that sense of security is just shattered.
Yeah.
And then there's guilt and regret.
Yeah. Like, all those what ifs.
All those what ifs.
Yeah. And that can be so hard to get out of.
It can be. Yeah.
And then grief even affects how we think, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, how does that show up?
Well, you might find it really hard to concentrate.
Yeah.
Like your mind's just not working the way it used to.
Right.
You might get stuck in these thought loops.
Yeah, like replaying the same thing over and over.
Exactly, like a broken record.
Yeah.
And then there's brain fog.
Yeah.
Like you can't think clearly, you're forgetting things.
Right.
Even your sense of time can get messed up.
Oh, wow.
It's like grief is hijacking your brain.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we often don't talk about how physically draining grief can be.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it takes a toll on your body.
For sure.
The Crossing the Creek guide had some really powerful examples of this.
Yeah. What were some of the things they talked about?
Well, like, your appetite can change so much.
Yeah.
Sometimes people just lose all interest in food,
Yeah.
but then sometimes they get, like, really specific cravings.
Right. Like that example of the person who only wanted maraschino cherries.
Oh, yeah.
That was powerful.
Yeah, and then bowel changes.
Mm-hmm. Things tend to slow down.
Okay.
And sometimes as someone's getting really close to death, everything just shuts down.
Wow.
And then there's changes in circulation too.
Yeah.
Like the hands and feet get cold.
Okay.
Sometimes they change color.
Yeah.
And even breathing can change.
Right.
Like the airway rattling.
Yeah. That sounds so scary.
It can be, but the guide said it's often more upsetting for the people around the person than for the person themselves.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And of course, grief can completely mess with your sleep.
Oh, for sure. Insomnia, nightmares. It's all part of it.
Yeah. Okay, so we've covered the physical, emotional, social, cognitive, even like, I guess we should touch briefly on the spiritual dimension of grief.
Yeah, that's a whole other deep dive waiting to happen.
Right. Yeah.
But it's there.
Yeah.
Like grief often brings up these huge questions
Right.
about meaning and purpose.
Yeah.
What happens after death?
All right. All the big questions.
Exactly. And everyone answers them differently.
Okay. So those are some of the ways like typical grief can show up. But our sources also talked about some other types of grief
Right.
that are important to understand. So can we talk about those a little bit?
Definitely.
Okay, so what is anticipatory grief?
So anticipatory grief, that's the grief you feel when you know a death is coming.
Oh, okay. So it's like before the actual death.
Exactly. And it affects both the person who's dying
Oh, wow.
and their loved ones.
So everyone's kind of grieving together.
Yeah, it's like this shared experience of starting to let go of the future you thought you'd have.
Yeah, like you're already missing them.
Exactly.
Okay, and then what about disenfranchised grief? That sounds so lonely.
It's grief that you can't really talk about openly.
Oh, wow.
Like society doesn't recognize it as valid.
So it's like you're grieving, but you can't even share it.
Exactly. And that can be so isolating.
Yeah.
And it's often because the loss itself is stigmatized or misunderstood.
What are some examples of that?
Well, like miscarriage.
Oh, yeah.
Or termination of pregnancy, death by suicide.
Okay.
Or even the loss of a same-sex partner.
Right.
In a place where that relationship isn't fully accepted.
So it's like your grief is doubled.
Exactly. You're grieving the loss, and you're also grieving the fact that you can't grieve openly.
Wow. Okay, and then ambiguous grief, that's another one that sounds really complicated.
It is so ambiguous. Grief is when there's no clear ending or closure.
Oh,
So
go.
there are two main types. One is when the person is physically there, but psychologically absent,
Like what kind of situations would that be?
like dementia,
Oh, yeah.
severe addiction, or mental illness.
Okay.
It's like people say, they're here, but they're not really here.
Wow. Yeah, that's so hard.
It is. And then the other type is the opposite,
Okay.
where they're psychologically present in your memories, in your heart,
Mm-hmm.
but physically absent.
Like a missing person.
Exactly. And
That-
in both cases, it's that lack of closure
Yeah.
that makes it so hard to process.
Okay. And then complicated grief, that sounds like when grief just doesn't let up.
Yeah, it's like grief gets stuck.
Okay.
So it's when you have a really hard time adapting to the death.
Okay.
Like the intense emotions and the symptoms,
Yeah.
they just don't fade.
So even months or years later.
Exactly. And it makes it almost impossible to function normally.
Yeah, like you can't move on with your life.
Right. And it's important to note that different cultures express grief differently.
Right.
So what's considered complicated grief in one culture
Yeah.
might be totally normal in another.
So you have to look at it in context.
Exactly, in context.
Yeah.
And there are different ways it can show up.
Okay.
Like chronic grief, where the symptoms just go on.
Yeah.
And then there's delayed grief, where you don't really grieve at first,
Oh, wow.
but then it hits you later.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you mentioned cumulative grief earlier. How does that work?
So cumulative grief, that's the impact of multiple losses over time,
Oh.
especially if you haven't fully processed the earlier ones.
So it's like all the grief piles up.
Exactly. And it makes each new loss feel even heavier.
Wow, that makes so much sense.
Yeah.
And I think it's also important to remember that within a family, grief is never one size fits all.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. Everyone's experience is going to be different.
Everyone grieves in their own way.
Yeah.
And it depends on so many things,
Yeah.
like their relationship with the person who died,
Yeah.
their age, their personality, their cultural background.
Totally. So even if you've all lost the same person,
Yeah,
you're all going to experience it differently.
for sure.
Okay, so let's talk specifically about kids now because they experience grief so differently.
They do. And I think the key is to understand that their concept of death changes as they grow.
Okay.
Like we as adults, we get that death is universal.
Right. Everyone died.
Everyone dies. It's inevitable. We're all mortal.
Yeah.
And it's irreversible. Like once you're dead, you're dead.
Right.
But little kids, they don't have the brain development to understand that yet.
Yeah.
So their grief is going to look different.
So what are some of the ways grief can show up in kids?
Well, you might see regression,
Okay.
like going back to behaviors they'd outgrown.
Like thumb sucking.
Yeah, thumb sucking, bedwetting,
Okay.
changes in behavior at school.
Yeah.
Their grades might drop, or they might become super focused on achieving.
Okay.
Some kids try to suppress their emotions.
Like they have to be strong.
Exactly. They have to be strong for everyone else.
Yeah.
And then, especially in teenagers, you might see riskier behaviors,
Okay.
like early sexual relationships.
Oh, wow.
Or what's sometimes called superhero behavior.
What's that?
It's when they try to act like everything's fine.
Oh, so they're just massing?
Exactly. They're masking their sadness and fear.
Okay, so one of the things the guide emphasized was being really direct with kids about death,
Yes.
like not using euphemisms.
No, those can actually be more confusing.
Really?
Yeah, because kids take things literally.
Right.
So if you say, Grandma's gone to sleep,
Yeah.
they might think she's going to wake up.
Oh, wow.
So it's important to use clear language
Okay.
and to answer their questions honestly,
Even if they're hard questions.
even if they're hard questions, and in a way they can understand.
Okay.
And letting them participate in rituals like funerals can be really helpful
Oh, how so?
because it helps them understand the finality of death.
Yeah.
And it shows them that they're not alone in their grief.
Right, like everyone's sad.
Everyone's sad.
Okay, so let's break it down by age group, starting with the littlest ones.
Okay?
Like babies and toddlers.
So 0 to 2 years old.
Yeah.
They obviously can't tell you what they're feeling,
Right.
but they sense that someone's missing.
Yeah.
They miss the physical feeling of that person.
Okay.
The smell, the sound, the routines.
Okay.
And you might see separation anxiety,
Hmm.
regression, like they were sleeping through the night and now they're not.
Oh, yeah.
They might get more irritable or clingy or even withdraw.
Okay.
They don't understand that death is permanent.
Right.
So they might think the person will come back,
Yeah.
but they still grieve the absence.
Okay, so how do we help them?
Well, routine is key.
Okay.
Keeping things as predictable as possible.
Okay.
Lots of physical comfort, like holding them when they're upset.
Yeah.
And if they get withdrawn, try to gently engage them in play.
Okay, what about young kids like 2 to 6?
So in this age group, they're still really focused on those sensory experiences.
Okay.
And separation is still a huge thing.
Yeah.
So you might see similar things: regression, irritability, clinginess, withdrawal.
Oh.
And developmentally, they still might not get that death is final,
Even for themselves.
especially for themselves.
Oh, wow.
They might think they did something to cause the death,
Oh, wow.
or that they can bring the person back.
Like magical thinking.
Exactly, magical thinking. And they might start to have new fears.
About their own safety?
Yeah, about their own safety and the safety of other loved ones.
So how do we support them?
Reassurance is so important.
Yeah.
Letting them know it's not their fault.
Right.
Gently correcting any magical thinking.
Yeah.
And again, routine.
It's predictability.
Predictability.
Mm-hmm.
And when you leave them, always explain when you'll be back.
Okay.
And give them lots of affection.
Yeah.
Physical closeness, that's really important for them.
And if they get withdrawn?
Yeah, try to encourage them to play.
Okay. And then what about older kids, like 7 to 12?
So now their thinking is getting more abstract.
Yeah, okay.
They might start asking those big philosophical questions.
About death and the meaning of life.
Exactly. And their grief might look more internal,
Okay.
like the withdrawn sadness we see in adults.
Yeah.
They might think about heaven or an afterlife.
Okay.
And they're starting to have these really powerful emotions.
So how do we support them at this age?
Well, be prepared for longer conversations.
Okay.
They might ask questions you don't have the answers to.
Right.
And it's okay to say, I don't know.
Yeah.
The important thing is to listen,
Mm-hmm.
validate their feelings,
Okay.
and give them a stable environment.
But not be too overprotective.
Right. They still need to express themselves.
Okay. And then teenagers, 13 to 18, what about them?
Teenagers, oh boy, they're a whole other challenge.
Right.
But the same principles apply.
Okay.
Be ready for those deep conversations.
Okay.
Accept their emotions, even when they're intense.
Yeah.
Give them a stable home, but don't restrict them too much.
Right. They need their independence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And try to explain why isolating themselves isn't helpful.
Yeah.
Encourage them to talk to people they trust. And let them know it's okay to not have all the answers.
Yeah.
Just being there is enough.
Okay. So one thing that seems to be common across all these age groups is fear.
Yeah, fear is a huge part of grief for kids.
What are they afraid of?
Well, pain is a big one.
Okay.
Both their own pain and the pain the person who died might have felt.
Right.
And they're also afraid of separation.
Yeah.
Like, what if someone else leaves them?
Right.
So you might see clinginess,
Mm.
nightmares, physical symptoms like stomach ache,
Okay.
and they might ask a lot of questions.
So how do we help them deal with that fear?
Honesty is key.
Okay.
Talk to them openly about what happened.
In a way they can understand.
Exactly. And try to figure out their specific fears
Okay.
so you can address them directly.
Yeah.
And give them as much control as possible.
Okay.
Like, let them make small choices.
Okay.
And one of the guides had this great phrase, commentating.
What does that mean?
It means explaining everything that's happening.
Oh.
Like, we're going to the hospital now because the doctor is going to.
Okay.
It helps them feel less afraid of the unknown.
So at what point should we be worried enough to seek professional help for a kid who's grieving?
That's a good question. So there are some red flags.
Okay, what are they?
If their anger is out of control,
Okay.
like they're hurting themselves or other people,
Yeah.
if their grief is so intense,
Yeah.
it's affecting their daily life.
Like they can't go to school.
Exactly. Or their grades plummet.
Okay.
If they're having nightmares or flashbacks.
Like PTSD.
Yeah, signs of PTSD.
Okay.
If they're really depressed, and especially if they talk about suicide,
Yeah.
and if they withdraw completely and avoid anything, that reminds them of the person who died.
Okay, so those are all signs that they need extra support.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the dying process itself
Okay.
and how grief plays into that whole experience.
So the dying process, it's a transition.
Right.
And one of the things our sources pointed out was that people tend to approach this transition using the same coping mechanisms they've used throughout their life.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so like if someone's always been really independent,
Yeah.
they might try to be really independent in their dying process too.
Wow.
And if they've always relied on humor,
Yeah.
they might use humor to cope with dying.
So their personality kind of stays consistent?
Exactly. It's fascinating.
So what are some of the physical things that tend to happen as someone approaches the end of life?
Well, appetite changes are really common.
Okay.
Usually a decrease in appetite.
Yeah.
They might not want to eat or drink as much.
Okay.
Bowel function changes too.
Okay.
Circulation slows down,
Mm-hmm.
especially in the hands and feet.
Okay.
So they might feel cold or look discolored.
Okay.
and breathing patterns change.
Yeah.
You might hear that airway rattling sound.
Which is more upsetting to the people around them.
Often, yes.
Okay.
They also tend to sleep more
Oh,
and
yeah.
be less alert.
And then confusion. Is that a common thing?
Yeah, confusion can definitely happen.
Okay.
And it's not always from physical causes.
Really?
Sometimes it's like their mind and spirit are starting to shift
Oh, wow.
as their connection to their body weakens.
Okay, so how does that confusion show up?
Well, they might get disoriented,
Okay.
like not know where they are or what time it is.
Right.
They might have really vivid dreams
Yeah.
or even seem to have personality changes.
Like saying things that are out of character.
Exactly. And it can be really unsettling for everyone,
Yeah.
but it's often just a natural part of the process.
Okay, so it's not always a bad sign?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay, and then pain. I mean, that's a big concern at the end of life, right?
It is, and it's complex.
Yeah.
Because sometimes pain can actually be a way for the person to stay connected to their body.
Really?
Yeah, if they're scared of what comes after death,
Yeah.
they might unconsciously hold on to the pain.
As a way to stay grounded.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But uncontrolled pain can also prevent them from doing that important resolution work.
What's that?
It's like that process of reviewing their life, making peace with things,
Yeah.
finding acceptance.
And pain can get in the way of that.
Exactly. So pain management should be about facilitating that process,
Yeah.
not just eliminating all pain.
So it's a delicate balance.
It is a delicate balance, and it's different for everyone.
Okay, and then this idea of symbolism in the dying process, that was really interesting.
Yeah, as they start to detach from the physical world,
Yeah.
their communication often becomes more symbolic.
Like metaphors.
Exactly,
Okay,
metaphors.
right.
So you might hear them say things like, I want to go home,
Yeah.
even if they're already at home.
Right.
Or it's time to get my things in order.
Yeah.
And they might use personal symbols too.
Right, like that crossing the creek example.
Exactly, that was so powerful.
Yeah, because it was tied to their personal history.
Right, it's their way of expressing what they're going through.
Okay, so grief, it's not just something that the people left behind experience.
No.
It's part of the dying process, too.
It is for both the person who's dying and their loved ones.
Yeah. So what are some of the emotions they might be going through?
Well, anger is a big one.
Yeah.
Anger at the illness, at the situation,
Yeah.
at the fact that they're dying.
Yeah.
Relief can also be there.
Really?
Yeah, relief that the suffering is ending.
Okay.
And of course, sadness.
Yeah.
Profound sadness
Yeah.
at leaving everyone behind.
And it's important to let them express all of those emotions.
Oh, absolutely. Even the ones that feel difficult.
Yeah.
And to remember that different cultures have different ways of mourning.
Right.
So what's considered appropriate in one culture
Yeah.
might be totally different in another.
So there's no right or wrong way to grieve.
Exactly.
Okay, so switching gears a bit now, what are some practical things we can do to support someone who's grieving?
Well, one of the most important things is just to be there,
Okay.
like a calm and steady presence.
Yeah.
You can't fix their pain,
Right.
but you can be a source of comfort.
So just being present.
Just being present
Okay.
and reassure them that whatever they're feeling is okay.
Sadness, anger, confusion, even relief, it's all normal.
Okay.
And sometimes the best thing you can do is just listen.
Yeah.
Like really listen without judgment.
Okay.
And sometimes words aren't even necessary.
Right.
Just sitting in silence with them can be really powerful.
Yeah. Like it's okay to not know what to say.
Exactly.
Okay. And then what about helping them acknowledge the reality of the death?
Yeah, that can be really important.
Okay.
Like saying the person's name, talking about them, remembering them.
Yeah.
It helps to make the loss real
Okay.
and to honor their memory.
And then what about helping them create a continuing bond with the person who died?
That's so important because the relationship doesn't end with death.
Right.
It just changes.
Yeah.
So encourage them to talk about the person,
Okay.
share stories, look at photos,
Mm-hmm.
maybe create a memory box.
Okay.
Find ways to keep their memory alive.
And it's okay for them to still feel connected.
Oh, absolutely. That's totally normal. Okay, you mentioned the dual process model of grief earlier. Can you explain that a bit more?
So the dual process model, it's basically this idea that people move back and forth between two ways of coping.
Okay, what are they?
One is loss orientation,
Okay.
where they're really focused on the grief,
Yeah.
talking about the person crying, remembering.
Right.
And the other is restoration orientation,
Okay.
where they're trying to adjust to life without the person.
Yeah. Expert speaker.